The first snow was falling, the day they tried to sell her. Fat, wet flakes that melted the instant. They touched the muck of the yard, and Tilda stood on the loading plank of the Vespa Company store, with her daughter held tight against her breastbone, and understood that no one in the crowd was going to look at her like she was a person. They were looking at her hands, at her back, the way a man looks at a mule he might buy if the price came down far enough. The factor, a soft, damp man named Quint, who smelled of ledger ink and old bacon, ran a thumb down the page and read out the sum of what her husband had owed before the fever took him, and the number meant nothing to her except that it was larger than anything she had ever held in her life. $41.25 to the company, Quint said, and the freight bond and the cost of planting him. The widow can work it off. She's young. She'll last. Somebody laughed. The snow kept coming. A man at the front called out $8 and said he'd take her, but the baby could go to the mission. And Tilda's whole body locked around the child, as if she could fold the girl back inside herself. The man's name was Dre, a freight hauler with a neck like a hog's shoulder, and he grinned at her the way you grin at something you've already decided is yours. Then the light in the doorway changed. She felt the cold draft of it before she saw him, a shape that filled the whole frame and blotted out the grey afternoon. Snow steaming off shoulders covered in elk hide, gone dark with grease and weather. He didn't take off his hat. He didn't say good day to anyone. He walked the length of that store with his boots, leaving wet half-moons on the boards, and he set a worn leather poke down on the counter in front of Quint without ever once raising his voice. Whatever he owed, the big man said, it's covered. They leave with me. His voice came up out of him like rock turning over underground. Quint opened the poke and went still at what he saw inside it, and the laughing stopped. And Dre took a half-step forward and said, now hold on. And the big man turned his head and looked at Dre, just looked, and Dre found something else to do with his hands. That was the whole of it. No speech. No flourish. He counted out what was needed in coin and dust, told Quint to keep what spilled over, and turned to her. Up close, he was uglier and older than the shadow had promised, a seam of white scar running from the corner of one eye down into a beard the color of wet bark, and Tilda did not feel saved. She felt traded, one owner for another, and this one big enough to break her over his knee. She had heard about men who lived alone in the high country, what the cold and the silence did to them. Her arms tightened until the baby squeaked. Get your things, he said. I don't have any things. Her voice came out, cracked, a stranger's voice. Everything she'd owned had been carried off against the debt while she watched. He took that in without expression. Then there's nothing to wait on. His name, she would learn later, was Holt. He had a single saddle horse, a rangy roan he called Job, and 2 pack mules loaded with the winter's lead, and salt and coffee, and when he led the horse around and told her to mount, she shook her head and said she could walk. He didn't argue with her. He just looked at her thin shoes, soaked through already, and at the child, and then he laced his fingers into a stirrup of his 2 hands, and waited, and there was no use in it, so she let him lift her up. He was careful not to touch more of her than he had to. She noticed that, and didn't know what to do with it. They went up out of the valley as the last light bled off the peaks, and the town fell away behind them, into its own smoke and meanness, and Tilda rode a dead man's debt up into the mountains behind a stranger. She was certain meant to be the end of her. She had a piece of broken glass in the pocket of her dress. She'd worked it loose from a busted bottle behind the store 3 days past, when she first understood what the auction would be, and she kept her fist around it now, until the edge bit into her palm. If he came for her in the dark, she would open his throat with it, or die trying. She'd already decided. A woman could decide a thing like that and feel almost calm. He must have known. Somewhere along the climb, where the sage gave out and the big pines closed in black. Overhead he glanced back, and his eyes went to her clenched hand in her pocket and stayed there a moment, and she braced for him to make her give it up. He didn't. He faced forward again, and after a while he said, not turning around, "Keep that where it is. Country up here'll test you. Good to have something sharp." She didn't answer, but her fist loosened, just slightly the way a hand does when it's been clenched too long to keep clenching. The baby was Junie, 5 months old and small for it, born in a wagon during the worst of the trouble. And she'd been quiet too long, which frightened Tilda more than crying would have. When the child finally did fuss, a thin, reedy sound with no strength behind it, Holt stopped the horse and pulled a strip of dried meat from his coat and a hard biscuit gone the color of bone. "Chew that soft," he said, holding the jerky up to her. "Don't let her swallow it whole, just enough to wet her mouth, and put a little salt in her. Eat the bread yourself." "I'm not hungry." "Didn't ask if you were hungry." He kept his hand out, patient as a stump. A weak woman's no use to a weak child. Eat. She hated him for being right. She took the food. It was full dark and bitter cold by the time they came out into a clearing under a granite face, and there sat the cabin, so low and rough it looked less built than grown, logs unpeeled and chinked with mud, a lean-to off the side where the animals would go. He helped her down. Her legs had gone to wood from the cold and the riding, and she stumbled, and his hand closed around her elbow to steady her, and she gasped and went rigid like a snared thing, and he let go of her at once and stepped back and gave her room, and she hated that she had flinched, and hated more that some small animal part of her had felt safe in that 1 second of being held up. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold ash and cured hide and pine pitch. 1 room, an iron stove, black with use, a rough table, a single bed in the corner heaped with furs, and on the walls traps and snowshoes, and a rack of 3 long guns. A man's whole hard life hung up on pegs. She stood by the door with the baby, and did not come further in, because every object in the place was a thing that could kill. He built the fire without speaking to her, coaxed it up out of shavings and pitchwood, until the iron began to tick and breathe. Heat lit a lantern and hung it from a beam, and the yellow light made the room smaller and stranger. He pointed at a stump near the stove. "Sit, warm her up." She sat. After a time, when the child began to root against her and cry in earnest from hunger, she fumbled at the buttons of her dress with her back. Half turned, mortified, and the baby would not latch, because there was so little left in her to give after the months of going without. She bent over Junie, and the tears came hot and silent down her face, and she hated herself for them. When she looked up, he had already turned his broad back to her and was busy at the stove. "I'll thin some oats down," he said to the wall. "Boil 'em soft and sweet with a little tallow. She can take that off your finger till you've got your strength back. You will, with feeding." "So will she." "Why," Tilda said, "it wasn't a thank you. It came out hard. Why'd you do it? $60-some for a half-starved woman and a baby that mightn't live the winter. You don't even have a looking glass in this place. What do you want from me?" He set the pot on the stove and stood there with his hands flat on the rough table, and for a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "I don't like crowds," he said finally, "and I don't like men who buy and sell people. That's the whole of it." He looked at her then, full on, and there was nothing in his face she could grab hold of and call a lie. "You're not bought. You're not beholden. Come spring. You want to go, I'll take you down myself and put coin in your hand for the road. Till spring. The snow makes the decision for both of us. Nobody crosses that pass alive once it closes. So you're here, but you're not mine. Eat. Sleep where it's warm." Then he did the thing she would turn over in her mind 100 times in the nights that came. He rolled the heaviest of the bear hides off his own bed, took a rifle down from the wall, and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" "Lean to." "Bed's yours. Keep the fire fed." Wood stacked by the door. He pulled the latch. The wind reached in and tore at the lantern flame. "Mules need the company anyhow. You can't sleep out there. It's freezing." Slept in worse, and he was gone into the black before she could say anything else. The door thudding shut, the cold sucking out of the room like a held breath let go. She sat a long while, listening to the fire, and to the wind worrying at the chinking, the baby finally heavy and asleep against her, full of warm oat water, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She thought about a man who would give up his bed and his warmth to a woman he'd known for half a day, a woman with broken glass in her pocket meant for his throat, and go lie down in the cold with his animals rather than make her afraid. She thought she had never in her life met anyone she understood less. She did not open her hand and put the glass aside that first night, but she set it on the table beside the bed instead of holding it, which was its own kind of decision. The days came on slow and white. He was up before light always, and she would wake to the sounds of him moving in the dark outside, the chuck of an axe, the grind of the well bucket, the low rumble of his voice, talking nonsense to the horse, the way some men can only talk gentle to a thing that won't talk back. He brought in wood, he brought in water. He skinned out a deer one morning, and the cabin smelled of blood and smoke for a day, and he packed cuts of it into the cold of the lean-to, and she watched him work and understood that every motion he made was a motion meant to keep them all alive, and that he never once asked her to thank him for any of it. She was no soft thing herself, and she would not be kept like a kept woman. The second morning she got up, before he could do it all, and split the kindling herself, badly, her hands blistering, and he came in and saw, and said nothing, only the next day left the smaller hatchet, leaning where she could reach it. The third day she had a pot of something edible on the stove when he came in stamping snow, and he ate 2 bowls of it without comment, and then said, wiping his beard, "That's the first warm food in this cabin that didn't taste like a campfire in 8 years," and went back out, and she stood there, absurdly pleased with herself, and furious that she was pleased. He never crowded her. He never let his eyes rest on her too long. When the cabin was too small for the both of them, he found a reason to be outside in weather that would kill a careless man, and she came to understand that the silence in him wasn't emptiness, but a kind of held breath. A man so long alone, he'd forgotten the shapes of ordinary words and was frightened, maybe, of getting them wrong. Junie began to fatten, began to cry like a healthy child, loud and demanding, and the sound of it filled the cabin, and Tilda caught Holt more than once standing still, with the axe forgotten in his hand, listening to it, something working behind his ruined face that she could not name. One evening the baby took hold of his thick finger in her fist, and would not let go, and he sat there at the table not moving for the better part of an hour, scared to pull free, and Tilda turned to the stove so he wouldn't see her smile. The thaw between them was that slow. A blanket left within reach, a bowl of food eaten without complaint, a word more each day than the day before. She stopped keeping the glass by the bed. She didn't remember deciding to stop. She only noticed one morning that it had been weeks since she'd thought of it. Then the cold turned mean in a way even Holt seemed to respect, a dry killing cold that came down off the peaks and sat on the clearing like a stone, and Junie woke in the night, burning with fever. Tilda knew the feel of it the instant she lifted the child. She had buried a sister to a winter fever as a girl, had watched the heat climb and the breath go ragged, and the terror of it came up her throat now, whole and immediate. The baby's skin was dry as paper, and too hot. Her cry gone weak again, and Tilda paced the cabin floor with her, and did everything she knew, which was nothing, which was wet cloths and prayer, and nothing. Holt came in from the cold at the sound of her, and stood over the child, and laid the back of one huge weathered hand against the small forehead, gentle as anything, and his jaw set. "There's a woman keeps goats down on the flat below the pass," he said. "Widow Bickle's place. Fresh milk does more for a fevered babe than oat water ever will, and the old man, he keeps remedies. Bark and roots, things that bring a heat down." He was already pulling on his heavier coat, already reaching for the rifle. "It's a hard ride down and harder back, but I can be there by dark and home by morning if the weather holds." "Don't." The word was out before she'd thought it. "It's too far." The cold. You said yourself nobody crosses the pass, he said. I'm not crossing the pass. I'm going down the near slope and I know every foot of it blind. He paused at the door with his hand on the latch and looked back at her, at the burning child in her arms. And for the first time since she'd known him, something soft and unguarded showed plain in his face. Keep her cool. Keep the fire low so she don't bake. I'll be back. Halt. But he'd already stepped out into the dark, and the door shut, and she was alone with her sick daughter and the long, howling night. She did not sleep. She bathed Junie's wrists and throat, and the soles of her tiny feet with cool cloths, until the fever broke just before dawn, and the child fell at last into a true sleep, breathing deep and even, and Tilda sat back against the bed frame, shaking with relief, and with the cold, and with how badly she now wanted the man to come home. Because the day came up grey and went over to grey dusk. She chopped wood she didn't need just to be doing something. She scraped a circle clear in the frost on the one small window and watched the tree line until her eyes ached. The light failed. The wind picked up. He should have been back by midday. He should have been back hours ago. And the guilt came down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. 'Cause he'd gone out into that white death for the baby. For her. And if the mountain had taken him, then his blood was on her hands as surely as if she'd held the glass to his throat after all. Then, far off and faint under the wind, the snort of a horse. She had the heavy bar off the door, and the door hauled open before she'd thought to do it, and the cold slammed into her, and there in the blue dark of the clearing stood Job, with his head hung low and steam pouring off his flanks, and tied across the saddle, struggling, was a nanny goat, but the saddle was empty. Her heart stopped in her chest. She ran out into the snow in her thin shoes, the cold of it a shock that went straight to the bone, and found him on the off side of the horse, on his feet, barely, one hand fisted in the stirrup leather to hold himself upright, and his boots dragging twin furrows through the drift. In the failing light, his face was the color of cold ash. His lips had gone blue. His left arm was clamped against his ribs, and his whole left side, his coat, his leg, was sheeted in frozen black blood. Got the milk, he said, and the words came out a wet whisper, and then his knees gave under him, and he went down into the snow face first, with a sound like a felled tree. No. She was on her knees beside him in the same breath, her hands in the lapels of his coat, hauling, and he was enormous, dead weight, immovable. No, you don't. You don't lie down here. Get up. Get up, you stubborn fool. Get up, he groaned, his eyes rolling white. Can't. You can and you will. The voice that came out of her she didn't recognize, low and savage and absolutely without fear, the last frightened thing in her burned clean away. You dragged me up this mountain when I wanted to die. You went down into that cold for my girl. You don't get to die in the yard like a sick dog. Do you hear me? You stand up. You stand up. Right now. She got his good arm over her shoulders and dug her feet into the frozen ground beneath the snow and pulled. And somewhere in him there was something that answered, because he set his teeth and a sound tore out of him that wasn't human, and his legs came under him, and the two of them, slipping and falling and rising again, crossed the 20 feet to the cabin door like a single, broken animal and fell through it onto the boards, inside. She kicked the door, shut behind them. In the lantern light, she got her first clear look at the wound, and her stomach dropped. His shirt had to come off. And she took his own skinning knife from his belt and slit the bloody wool away from him, peeling it back, and there along the lower ribs ran a jagged slash a hand's breadth long, deep enough that the white of bone showed at the bottom of it through the dark welling blood. But it wasn't pumping bright and fast. He hadn't lost the big vessel. He'd been bleeding slow for hours, freezing as he rode, and the cold had likely been the only thing that kept it from killing him outright. Whiskey, he managed, under the bed, clay jug. She found it, dragged it out, poured boiling water from the stove over a clean rag, and another over her own hands. She knelt in his blood and didn't shake. "This is going to burn worse than the wound did," she said. "Then do it." She poured the raw spirit straight into the open meat of him. His back arched off the floor, and every muscle in his huge frame went to iron, and he bit down so hard she heard his teeth grind, and a low animal moan came out of his nose, and his fists struck the boards once, hard, rattling the whole cabin. She packed the hot rag deep into the slash and bore down on it with both hands and her whole weight. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry." Then she went for his own sewing kit on the shelf, the curved leather needle, and the spool of waxed sinew he used to mend harness, and she threaded it with hands slick to the wrist with his blood, and she took his face in her two red hands and made him look at her. "I've only ever sewn quilts and sacking," she told him. "I don't know the right way of this. Just close it." His voice was almost gone. "Don't be soft. Pull it tight." She pinched the gaping edges together. His skin was thick as harness leather, scarred over a lifetime of weather, and when she set the point of the needle to it and pushed, it would not go through. And she had to put her thumb to the eye of it and shove with her whole arm before the needle broke the flesh with a sound like a knife in green wood. He gasped. His knuckles went white on the floorboards. She pulled the sinew through and tied it off and set the next one, and to keep him from going under, to keep him here with her, she made him talk. "Why," she said, driving the needle again, "why are you torn up like this? What happened down there?" "Robbing old Bickle." He got the words out between his teeth. "3 of them came on it as I was leaving with the goat. Couldn't ride past it. You took a knife in the ribs over an old man's milk goat. Took it, 'cause Dre was one of them." His eyes squeezed shut as she pulled the thread tight. Same Dre from the store. He recognized the goat, the horse. He laughed and said, "Come spring." When the pass opened, he was coming up this mountain to take back what the mountain man stole. "Said he'd take you," said the baby could. He stopped. His jaw worked. I didn't let him finish saying it. Her hands went still over the wound. She knelt there in his blood, with the needle hanging from his side, and stared at his grey, ruined face. And she understood all at once and completely that the wound under her hands had not been taken for a goat, or for an old man, or for any reason but one. He had bled himself half to death on a frozen trail to make sure those men never said her name out loud again. "You stubborn mule!" The tears came up and blinded her, and she scrubbed them off on the back of her wrist, and left a smear of his blood across her own cheek. "You don't fight 3 armed men with a skinning knife. You're supposed to be the smart one. You're supposed to live." "Ah, didn't die," he murmured, and the ghost of something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his blue lips. "Got the milk." It took her the better part of an hour to close him. By the last knot he'd long since passed out from the pain, and she cut the sinew and sat back on her heels, spent past all bearing, every inch of her painted in him. She couldn't move him. He was too heavy, and she had nothing left. So she dragged the mattress off the bed and down beside him on the floor and worked the bare hides under his back, rolling him a little at a time off the cold boards, and piled every blanket in the cabin over the both of them. Then she went out one last time into the killing dark and led the trembling horse into the lean-to and rubbed him down and forked him hay. Because Holt would have, and she untied the goat and brought the complaining creature into the warmth of the cabin and tied her to the table leg, and she milked her into a tin cup and warmed it at the edge of the stove and fed her healthy, sleeping daughter. The rich first milk, a swallow at a time off the end of a clean rag, and then she lay down on the floor of that crude cabin in the high, lonesome country, her back against the slow rise and fall of the big man's chest, her child asleep in the crook of her arm, and she listened to his heart go on beating, steady and stubborn and alive, beneath all those blankets, and she did not feel bought, and she did not feel traded, and she did not feel like a widow on a loading plank with her arms full of debt. The wind beat against the walls and could not get in. The fire burned. She closed her eyes. He was a long time mending. The fever came for him too, 3 days of it, and she fought it off him the way she'd fought it off the baby, with cool cloths and bone broth spooned past his lips, and her voice low in the dark telling him he didn't have her permission to die. On the fourth morning his eyes came open clear and found her face above him, and he looked at her a while, and then he looked at the goat tied to the table leg, and the baby fat and pink in the basket by the stove, and something came loose in him that she had never seen, and the big silent man turned his face to the wall so she wouldn't watch him weep. She let him have it. She turned back to the stove and gave him that privacy, the way he'd given her hers 100 times. But she reached out without looking and laid her hand over his, and after a moment his fingers turned and closed around hers, careful, like a man holding something he was afraid of breaking, and neither of them said a word, because by then they'd both learned that the truest things between them never came out as words. Anyhow, he healed crooked and slow. By the time he could stand and split wood again, the worst of the winter had broken its back, and they had fallen somewhere in all those close cabin days into the shape of a thing neither of them would have known how to name out loud. He started leaving the door of the lean-to and sleeping by the stove. She started leaving the smaller hatchet leaned where he could reach it without bending his bad side. Junie learned to laugh that winter. A fat, outrageous baby laugh, and the first whole word she ever made was a sound that wasn't quite his name, but was reaching for it. And Tilda watched the both of them and understood that the family she'd been certain she'd lost on a loading plank in the snow had only been waiting up the mountain for her to climb to it. Spring came the way it does in the high country, all at once, and violent, the snow rotting off the slopes, and the creek coming up brown and roaring, and the day the pass finally opened, Holt saddled the roan and stood in the dooryard a long time, without saying what he'd come out to say, and Tilda came and stood beside him with the baby on her hip. "Pass is clear," he said at last, looking at the mountains and not at her. "I said I'd take you down come spring. Put coin in your hand for the road. A man keeps his word." The wind moved in the new green of the pines. Down below, the whole hard world waited, the town and its meanness, and a man named Dre, who'd sworn to climb up here after her. "I'm not going down that mountain," Tilda said. He turned and looked at her then. "Not unless you're coming too," she said, "and not to leave, to stand at that store and let them all see whose family this is now." She shifted the child on her hip and met his eyes, and there was no glass in her pocket and no fear in her at all. "I was sold once for a dead man's debt, Holt. I'll not be given away again. Not even by you, not even kind." He looked at her for a long moment, this huge, ruined, gentle man who'd carried 2 starving strangers up out of the cold, because he could not do otherwise, and then the whole hard country of his face broke open into something she'd waited all winter to see, and he reached out one big scarred hand and laid it against her wind-bitten cheek, careful, the way he held everything he was afraid to lose. "Then we stay," he said, "and come what comes up that pass, it comes through me first," and it did in time, and that's a story of its own. But that morning they only stood together in the new sun, with the baby reaching for the both of them. 3 broken people the world had thrown away, who had refused against every reason to lie down in the snow and freeze.